A former Marine was driving along the Maine coast during a violent nor'easter, his headlights cutting through sheets of rain and fog. He wasn't heading anywhere, just trying to outrun memories that never really left. Then he slowed. On the roadside, a wounded German shepherd lay in the rain. Water ran down her fur, but she didn't move. Even injured, she kept her body curled protectively around a tiny puppy beneath her. The man had once lost a military dog in war and swore he would never care again. So, why did he stop? And what he discovered that night would uncover a truth hidden along the coastline, one that might restore your faith in second chances. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe for more. Cold Atlantic rain slashed across the narrow coastal road between Machias and Lubeck. Wind howled off the ocean, flattening the grass along the shoulder, while fog drifted low over dark rock and tide pools. Headlights struggled through the storm, turning the wet asphalt into a trembling ribbon of reflected light that seemed to disappear into the sea. Rowan Hale drove without a destination, both hands steady on the wheel, shoulders slightly hunched, as if bracing against something unseen. He was 41, tall and lean, with a narrow face carved by sharp cheekbones and a jaw that looked permanently set. A short, uneven beard shadowed his chin, streaked faintly with early gray. His dark hair, cut roughly by his own hand, had grown uneven at the temples. The lines around his eyes were deeper than his age suggested. He wore a faded canvas jacket over a dark thermal shirt, sleeves pushed halfway up his forearms. Rowan moved with the quiet economy of someone trained to minimize noise, deliberate, contained, alert even when alone. Nothing about him suggested ease. Even stillness looked like tension held under control. He had not planned to be on this road, or anywhere in particular. Since leaving the Marines 3 years earlier, Rowan drifted through work that required silence, repairing docks, patching lobster boats, hauling rope and timber. He rented a small cabin overlooking the Atlantic, far enough from town that no one stopped by unless something broke. He preferred it that way. People asked questions, animals expected loyalty. Both made him uneasy. Solitude did not heal him, but it kept things predictable. The windshield wipers dragged rhythmically across the glass, left, right, left, right. Rowan found comfort in repetition. Storms, too, had patterns. Wind rose, then dropped. Rain thickened, then softened. The ocean crashed, then retreated. War had not worked like that. War had been noise without warning, silence without meaning, loss without preparation. Lightning flickered across the water. For a fraction of a second, the reflection on the road resembled a flash he remembered too well. Rowan's grip tightened before he could stop it. His breathing changed, slower, controlled. He counted without realizing it. 1, 2, 3, 4. He had learned that after Afghanistan, after Atlas. Atlas had been more than a military working dog. He had been Rowan's partner. A sable-coated German shepherd with alert amber eyes and a narrow scar along his right flank from a previous deployment. Atlas moved with quiet confidence, ears forward, tail low but steady. He had a habit of leaning lightly against Rowan's leg when they paused, not for reassurance, but as if confirming their shared presence. Rowan trusted him more than anyone else in the unit. Atlas detected explosives, tracked movement, and once pulled Rowan backward seconds before a hidden pressure plate detonated. Their bond had formed without ceremony, built through heat, dust, and the constant understanding that either of them could disappear in an instant. The day Atlas died, the desert had been unnaturally still. Rowan remembered that detail more than the explosion itself. No wind, no sound. Atlas had moved ahead, nose low, then froze. Rowan stepped forward. The blast came from the side, secondary device. The shock wave threw Rowan backward. When his hearing returned, everything sounded distant and muffled. He crawled toward Atlas. The dog was still breathing, shallow and uneven. Rowan pressed his hand into Atlas's fur, whispering words he never remembered later. Atlas's eyes stayed fixed on him until they didn't. The silence afterward felt heavier than the explosion. Rowan blinked, forcing himself back to the present. The truck rolled through standing water, tires hissing softly. He preferred the surface. Cold, controlled, manageable. Outside, the storm intensified, rain striking harder now. Visibility shrank to a narrow tunnel of light. He almost missed the sound. At first, it blended with the wind, a thin, broken noise that could have been metal rattling or branches scraping. Rowan drove past the spot before the sound registered fully. His jaw tightened. He told himself it was nothing, just the storm, just imagination. He kept driving. Then it came again. Not loud, not desperate, just a faint, strained whimper carried between gusts. Rowan eased off the accelerator. The truck slowed. He did not stop immediately. His mind offered reasons to continue. Animals got hit on coastal roads all the time. Someone else would find it. He wasn't equipped. He wasn't responsible. He had driven past injured animals before. He told himself this would be no different. Stopping meant responsibility. Responsibility meant attachment. And attachment meant loss. The truck rolled forward another 20 yards. Rowan exhaled sharply and pulled onto the narrow shoulder. He sat still for a moment, engine idling. Rain hammered the hood. Headlights cut across scrub grass and dark stone. He stared ahead, unmoving, as if waiting for the storm to decide for him. The sound came again, fainter now, but unmistakable. Rowan shifted into park. He rested his forehead briefly against the steering wheel, eyes closed. He knew this feeling, the pull between instinct and resistance. He had felt it before stepping toward danger, before running back into smoke, before reaching for Atlas. Every time he had told himself he could choose not to. Every time he had chosen anyway. He opened the door. Wind forced it wider, rain immediately soaking the sleeve of his jacket. Cold air hit his face, sharp and salted by the sea. Rowan stepped onto wet gravel. The headlights illuminated the roadside. That was when he saw her. A German shepherd lay half in the grass, half on the gravel edge. Her coat was darkened by rain, fur flattened against a lean frame. Water ran down her body in narrow streams, but she did not move. Even from a distance, Rowan could see the unnatural angle of her hind leg. One ear was torn near the tip. Her breathing was shallow, visible only in the faint rise of her ribs. Curled tightly beneath her chest, nearly hidden, was a tiny puppy pressed against her belly. The mother dog's body formed a shield against the wind. Rowan stopped walking. The stillness struck him first. Not panic, not movement, just quiet endurance. The way she held position reminded him of Atlas, waiting, even while hurt. The memory surfaced before he could stop it. Atlas lying in dust, eyes fixed, refusing to move until Rowan reached him. The mother dog lifted her head slightly. Her eyes met Rowan's, clouded with pain, but steady. No growl, no attempt to rise, just awareness. Rowan felt the old instinct rise, to assess, to plan, to act. He forced himself to remain still. He didn't want this. He didn't want the responsibility, the attachment, the inevitable ending. He had built his life carefully around distance. No one depended on him, no one waited for him, no one could be lost. The puppy shifted slightly beneath her chest, emitting a faint, high sound. The mother dog adjusted despite visible pain, pressing closer around it. Rowan inhaled slowly. Rain soaked through his jacket, cold against his skin. He told himself he could turn back, walk to the truck, drive away, forget this moment. It would become just another blurred memory, another thing he didn't save, but he didn't move. The mother dog's gaze never left him, not pleading, not aggressive, just present, as if acknowledging him as the only choice left in the storm. Rowan took one step forward, then another. He crouched slowly, careful not to startle her. Up close, he saw more detail, a deep gash along her shoulder, blood diluted by rain, scraped paws, breathing uneven. The puppy beneath her was small, perhaps only weeks old, its lighter fur trembling but quiet. Rowan's hand hovered in the air before he realized he had reached out. He stopped himself, fingers curling slightly. He remembered Atlas's fur beneath his palm, the warmth, the stillness afterward. He almost withdrew. The mother dog didn't flinch. Wind howled across the road. Rain pressed sideways. Rowan exhaled, long and quiet. He knew this was the moment he had tried to avoid for years. If he helped them, he wouldn't be able to pretend he didn't care. and once he cared, he might lose them too. Still, he reached forward. For the first time in a long while, Rowan Hale chose not to walk away. By the time Rowan got them back to the cabin, the rain had soaked through every layer he wore. The storm still pressed in from the Atlantic, though the worst of the wind had begun to shift northward. His cabin stood alone on a narrow rise above the rocky shoreline, an aging structure of gray cedar planks bleached by salt and years of hard weather. A single porch light trembled in the wind, casting a weak halo over stacked firewood, a rusted lobster trap, and the wet railing slick with spray. Rowan parked close to the steps and killed the engine. For a moment, he sat in the darkness, listening. The silence inside the truck no longer felt empty. It held two strained breaths and one decision he could not undo. He got out first and opened the passenger side door. The mother dog had not moved much. Rain had darkened her coat into a near-black sheen, and her breathing came shallow and uneven, each breath seeming to catch halfway through. The puppy was still pressed beneath her chest, half hidden by her foreleg. Rowan slid one arm beneath the mother's shoulders and the other under her ribs, careful to avoid the injured leg. She tensed at the lift but did not resist. Her weight surprised him, not heavy, but heavier than something so close to failing should have been. He carried her toward the cabin, boots scraping across wet boards, then set her down just inside the doorway before turning back for the puppy. The little thing was shivering violently now, too small for the cold and too stubborn to stay put. Rowan scooped it up in one hand, feeling the rapid flutter of its heartbeat against his palm, and carried it inside as well. The cabin smelled of wood smoke, damp wool, machine oil, and the faint trace of salt that lived in every seam of the place. Rowan kicked the door shut behind him and moved quickly. He laid the mother dog near the stone fireplace, where yesterday's ash still held a little heat, then crouched beside her and began to assess what he could. One hind leg was likely broken. The shoulder wound was deeper than it had looked in the headlights, a torn gash matted with rain and diluted blood. There was swelling along her ribs, and he didn't need a veterinarian to guess that something inside might be damaged too. He knew enough to understand the difference between treatment and stabilization. Tonight, all he could do was help her survive the dark. The puppy wandered in an unsteady circle near the fireplace, then stumbled against Rowan's boot. It was tiny, perhaps 5 weeks old, with soft sable fur that turned lighter along the chest and muzzle. Its ears had not settled yet, one folding halfway while the other tried unsuccessfully to rise. Its paws were too large for the rest of it, giving it an awkward, unfinished look as though it had been built in a hurry and told to grow later. Rowan ignored it and opened a dented metal first aid box from the kitchen shelf. Gauze, antiseptic, bandage wrap, adhesive tape, a thermometer that might still work. He carried the box back to the fire and got to work. He rinsed the shoulder wound with warm water first, then antiseptic diluted enough not to burn too harshly. The mother dog flinched once but did not snap. Rowan pressed a folded towel against the wound until the bleeding slowed, then wrapped it with careful pressure. He checked the broken leg next, stabilizing it as best he could with a strip of kindling smoothed flat and secured with cloth torn from an old shirt. His hands moved without hesitation. He had done similar work before, though never in a room this quiet. In war, there had always been shouting, urgency, orders, motion. Here, there was only the crackle of kindling, the hiss of rain against the windows, and the sound of one animal fighting to stay in the world, while another stayed close enough to feel it happen. When he finished, Rowan fed 2 split logs into the fireplace and crouched there until the flames caught properly. Heat began to move through the room in slow waves. He folded an old wool blanket and eased it beneath the mother dog's side, then draped another across the floor nearby so the puppy would have somewhere warmer to settle. The puppy ignored the blanket and pushed immediately back against its mother's belly. The mother shifted, despite the obvious pain, trying to curve her body around it. Rowan stood and went to the sink to wash blood from his hands. The water ran rusty for a second through the pipes before clearing. He stared at his reflection in the dark window above the sink and barely recognized it. Sharp eyes, tired face, the same expression he had worn in too many temporary places. He had built his life around avoiding moments like this. Caring was dangerous because it invited memory, and memory never arrived alone. It brought heat, Dust, explosions, unfinished promises, and the unbearable stillness that followed them. Behind him, the puppy let out a soft, uncertain whimper. Rowan closed his eyes for a second, then opened a can of soup and set it on the stove. He moved through the kitchen quietly, as if not disturbing the room might keep him from becoming part of it. He heated the soup, tore a piece of bread in half, and ate standing up. He could feel the presence behind him the entire time. Not just the animals themselves, but the fact of them. The cabin had not held another living thing in months. Now every corner seemed altered. He poured water into a shallow bowl and carried it to the mother dog. She tried to lift her head, failed, and rested again. Her eyes found him immediately. This time the look was different, less like assessment, more like confirmation. She was checking whether he was still there. Rowan set the bowl within reach and stepped back. The puppy drank first, clumsy and eager, then nosed its mother's muzzle before curling against her neck. The mother exhaled and tried to lower her head over it, managing only halfway. "You'll make it till morning," Rowan said quietly, though he wasn't sure whether he believed it. His own voice sounded rough, as if unused. He sat down in the chair nearest the fireplace but kept his boots planted and his body angled toward the door, as though he might still leave. Morning was the line he drew in his mind. In the morning, he would drive them to the veterinary clinic in town. He would hand them over. He would let someone else decide what came next. He repeated the plan until it resembled duty instead of retreat. Hours passed slowly, the storm weakened by degrees, but rain still streamed across the windows, and gusts rattled the loose corner of the porch roof. Rowan stretched out once on the narrow bed in the back room and lasted less than 10 minutes. Every small sound pulled him upright again. The scratch of tiny claws on wood, the shift of blanket against the floor, the uneven rhythm of the mother dog's breathing. He checked them twice, then 3 times, though nothing had changed. Each time he told himself he was only making sure she remained stable enough for transport. Each time he stayed a little longer. Near midnight, the mother dog tried again to raise her head. The effort showed in the tightening along her shoulders and neck. Rowan crossed the room before he thought about it and knelt beside her. She looked at him with that same strained steadiness, not asking, not yielding, enduring. The puppy slept curled against her side, one paw across the wrapped bandage, as if it belonged there. For a moment, Rowan could not breathe properly. The posture, the waiting, the refusal to let go before someone else had taken over. It all dragged Atlas back into the room. He remembered the dog's head heavy in his hand, the fixed attention in those final minutes, the unnatural effort of staying awake simply because Rowan was still there to see it. The resemblance was not physical. It was something worse, a pattern, a feeling, the quiet loyalty of a creature refusing to leave before it was sure its burden had been passed on. "I'm not keeping either of you," Rowan said, low enough that the words almost disappeared into the fire. The mother dog blinked once, slowly. Rowan stood and paced the room, then stopped by the window again. Outside, the ocean was invisible, but he could hear it in the dark, heavy and constant below the bluff. He had spent 3 years narrowing his life to manageable dimensions: work, cabin, road, sleep when possible, silence when not. No one needed him, and that had been the closest thing to peace he could build. Need was dangerous. Attachment was worse. He looked back toward the fire. The puppy had moved in its sleep and now lay partly on the spare blanket Rowan had spread out earlier. One tiny ear twitched with each breath. The mother dog had lowered her head, but her eyes opened again when Rowan shifted his weight. Not fear this time, not even caution. It was closer to trust than he wanted to name, not complete trust, just enough to rest for a second because he was still in the room. That unsettled him more than any growl would have. Rowan added another log to the fire and sat on the floor with his back against the wall, farther away than the chair, as if distance might still mean something. The room warmed slowly. The puppy made a small sound and settled deeper into sleep. The mother dog kept waking in brief intervals, each time lifting her head just enough to find him. Each time she saw him, some rigid part of her eased. He knew what that meant. She was staying conscious by force, measuring the room, waiting until she was certain her puppy would not be left alone. Rowan dragged one hand over his face. "Morning," he muttered, like the word itself could hold the boundary. "You make it to morning, and that's the end of it. But even as he said it, the sentence felt thinner than it should have. After that, he stopped pretending he would sleep. He listened instead, to the brittle pop of firewood, to rain softening against the roof, to the two different patterns of breathing near the hearth. One fast and small, one slower, strained, and stubborn. He listened longer than he meant to, longer than a man trying not to care should have listened. By the time the first hint of gray touched the windows, Rowan was still awake, still in the same place, already dreading the morning that would ask him to let go. Morning came pale and colorless, the storm reduced to a fine Atlantic drizzle that blurred the harbor and softened the horizon into a single gray band. The wind had weakened, but the cold remained sharp, biting through Rowan's jacket as he carried the mother dog from the cabin. Her body felt lighter, not because she had healed, but because something inside her was fading. The puppy stumbled in anxious circles near Rowan's boots until he bent and lifted it with his free hand. He placed both of them carefully inside the truck, wrapping the mother in the same blanket from the night before. The puppy pressed itself against her chest, nose buried in her fur, as if the familiar scent alone could hold her in place. The road into town followed the coastline before cutting inland toward the harbor. Rowan drove in silence, hands steady on the wheel. The mother dog's breathing came shallow and uneven, occasionally pausing long enough that Rowan glanced sideways to make sure she was still alive. The puppy lifted its head once, licking weakly at her muzzle, then settled again. Rowan told himself he was only completing a task, a clinic, transfer responsibility, leave. The plan sounded clean in his mind, but each mile made it feel less certain. More veterinary care stood beside the harbor in a converted bait shed, its white paint weathered by salt and wind. A hand-painted sign hung slightly crooked above the door. Rowan parked close and carried the mother dog inside while the puppy followed, slipping once on the wet threshold. The warmth inside was thin but immediate, smelling of antiseptic, coffee, and damp fur. Rachel Moore stepped from behind the counter as soon as she saw them. She was tall and slender, with long arms and narrow shoulders that gave her a quiet, utilitarian presence. Her dark brown hair was tied loosely, and faint shadows under her hazel eyes suggested too many early mornings and too few days off. Her skin was pale from fluorescent light, but her expression remained steady, focused. She did not waste time with questions. "Back room," she said, already opening the door. Rowan laid the mother dog onto the table. Rachel worked quickly, checking pupils, breathing, ribs, and abdomen. Her movements were efficient but careful, fingers gentle, even when probing painful areas. The puppy circled beneath the table, whining softly. "She was hit hard," Rachel said quietly. "Broken leg, internal trauma. You kept her alive overnight. That matters." She paused before continuing. "But she's critical. I can manage pain and fluids, but she may only have a short time." Rowan nodded once. He had heard similar sentences before, delivered in the same calm tone. Loss, when spoken professionally, always sounded measured and distant. Rachel placed an IV line and wrapped the mother dog in heated blankets. The puppy climbed beside her immediately, pressing close. The mother dog stirred faintly, nose brushing the small body. Rowan noticed the movement and looked away. "She's very young," Rachel said. 5 weeks, maybe 6. Too early to be without her mother." Rowan said nothing. Rachel glanced at him briefly. There have been more dogs like this lately, found along roads, abandoned, not strays. She shook her head slightly. "Something's happening out there." The day passed slowly. Rain faded to mist. Fishing boats moved in and out of the harbor beyond the fogged windows. Rowan remained in the recovery room longer than he planned, sitting in a chair near the wall. The puppy rarely moved far from the mother dog. Occasionally it tried to climb onto her neck, then settled again. By afternoon, the mother dog opened her eyes briefly. Rowan leaned forward without realizing it. Her gaze drifted, unfocused at first, then steadied when it found him. She did not move, only watched. The puppy nudged her muzzle, and she responded with a faint shift. Rowan felt something tighten in his chest. Rachel entered quietly, checked the monitor, and adjusted the blanket. "She's holding on," she said softly. "Sometimes they wait, not for themselves, for something else." Rowan didn't respond. Evening settled early. The clinic grew quiet as the last appointment left. Rachel dimmed the lights in the recovery room. Rowan remained seated near the blankets, elbows on his knees. The puppy had fallen asleep against the mother's chest. After a long stretch of silence, the mother dog stirred again. Her head lifted slightly, trembling with effort. Rowan stood immediately. The puppy woke and pressed closer. The mother dog turned her muzzle slowly, licking the puppy once, deliberately, as if memorizing the motion. Then she looked at Rowan. The gaze held longer this time, not confused, not searching, a steady, deliberate look. Rowan felt the same cold recognition he had known years earlier. Atlas had looked at him like that, quiet, certain, aware of what was coming. Rachel stepped beside him, listening with her stethoscope. The mother dog's breathing faltered once, then again. The puppy whined softly, pawing at her chest. Rowan whispered, "Hey." The mother dog exhaled slowly, her head lowered. She did not breathe again. The room stayed silent. The puppy nudged her muzzle repeatedly, whining louder now, confused by the stillness. Rowan stepped back, jaw tight. Rachel wrapped the mother dog gently in a blanket. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. The puppy began crying in short, broken sounds. Rowan picked it up instinctively. It pressed against his jacket, trembling. Outside under the awning, rain dripped from the roof in slow intervals. Rowan handed the puppy back to Rachel. "I can't take it," he said. Rachel studied him. "You don't have to decide right now." "I do." Rowan stared toward the harbor. "I lost one before. I can't do that again." Rachel nodded slowly. "I'll find someone." Rowan turned and stepped toward the truck. Behind him came a faint scraping sound. He stopped. The puppy had slipped from Rachel's arms and landed clumsily on the wet boards. It tried to walk, legs unsteady, then crawled toward Rowan, whining softly. Each step was awkward, but it kept moving, eyes fixed on him. Rowan didn't move. Rain tapped the roof. The puppy slipped once, recovered, and crawled closer. Rowan felt the same weight settle in his chest as before. He stood in the drizzle, watching the small animal drag itself across the porch. And for the first time that morning, the plan to leave felt impossible to complete. By the time Rowan left the clinic, the drizzle had thinned to a cold mist hanging over the harbor. He did not look back at the porch. He had already seen enough there, the wet boards, the tiny body dragging itself toward him, the kind of trust that arrived before permission. Rachel handed him a paper bag at the door without making the moment harder than it already was. Inside were powdered formula, a small bottle, a folded towel, and a handwritten feeding schedule in narrow, practical script. "Just for a few days," Rowan had said. Rachel only nodded. She had the rare sense not to argue with a promise a man was making mostly to himself. The puppy rode back to the cabin in the same blanket from the clinic, wrapped so tightly that only its dark eyes and narrow muzzle showed. Without its mother, it seemed even smaller, as though grief had reduced its size as well as its sound. Rowan drove with one hand on the wheel and the other braced near the seat, not touching the puppy, only making sure it would not tumble when the truck turned over the wet coastal road. The fog still sat low over the shoreline, muting the Atlantic into a dull strip of steel. Everything outside looked suspended between storm and clearing. Inside the cabin, the absence hit him first. Molly's shape was gone from the place near the fireplace, but the room still held the memory of her. Rowan set the puppy down on a folded blanket near the hearth, then stood there longer than he meant to, staring at the empty patch of floorboards where the mother had lain through the night. The puppy waddled toward that spot, sniffed it, turned once in a confused circle, and let out a small, searching sound. Rowan turned away before the sound could settle too deeply. He moved through the kitchen with the clipped focus of a man completing a task. Rachel's note said the puppy needed warmth first, then formula in small amounts. Rowan heated water, mixed the powdered formula, and tested it against the inside of his wrist the way the note instructed. He found an old ceramic bowl too deep for the puppy, discarded it, then used the bottle instead. The first attempt went poorly. The puppy mouthed the rubber tip, coughed, sneezed, then blinked up at him with offended confusion. Rowan almost gave up and set the bottle aside, but the puppy tried again, clumsy and determined. Eventually, it drank enough to quiet its trembling. Up close, the little thing looked even younger in the firelight. Its coat was a soft blend of sable and faded gold, darker along the spine, lighter under the chin and chest. One ear folded forward while the other stood halfway, undecided. Its paws were too large, its legs too narrow, and there was something unfinished about the whole animal, as if life had set it down in the world before it was fully assembled. Rowan dried the milk from its muzzle with the edge of the towel, and immediately regretted the gentleness of the gesture. He told himself again that this was temporary. A few days. Feed it. Keep it alive. Find someone else. He did not touch it more than necessary, did not speak to it except in short, practical murmurs, did not let it climb into his lap when it nosed uncertainly toward his knee. He spread a second blanket by the fire instead. The puppy settled there reluctantly, eyes following him whenever he crossed the room. By late afternoon, the cabin had grown quieter in a new way, not empty, but occupied. Rowan found himself adjusting to the presence against his will. He kept noticing small things, the uneven scratch of tiny claws on old floorboards, the way the puppy startled at sudden sounds, but calmed when it saw him again, the way it tried to remain in whatever room he had entered last. It did not behave like a stray. It behaved like something that had lost its center and was trying to attach itself to the nearest remaining shape. The wind returned after dark, not with the full violence of the storm, but with enough force to make the porch boards creak and the loose latch near the side door click at irregular intervals. Rowan fed the puppy again, this time with less spilling, then sat at the small wooden table pretending to read an old repair manual. He did not absorb a word. The puppy had fallen asleep beside the leg of his chair, curled so tightly that its nose disappeared beneath one oversized paw. The first hard gust hit the side of the cabin near midnight. Rowan was on his feet before he knew he had moved. The noise, wood struck by pressure, metal latch snapping, the brief shudder of the walls, tore through the room with the wrong shape. For one fractured second, it was not wind. It was force, impact, the concussion before a sound fully reached the body. Rowan's pulse kicked hard, his chest tightened, the firelight blurred at the edges. He turned toward the door, shoulders rigid, scanning the dark corners of the room as if he had woken somewhere far hotter and more dangerous than coastal Maine. Another gust slammed against the siding. The puppy woke in panic, scrambling over the blanket with no coordination at all. It tried to run, failed, then made straight for Rowan's boot and pressed itself against his ankle, trembling so hard that its whole body shook. Rowan did not move. His breathing had gone too shallow. The room seemed both too small and too far away. Then the puppy, still shaking, tried to climb onto his boot, its tiny claws catching briefly against the denim at his cuff. The warmth of that small body reached him before the meaning of it did. Rowan looked down. The puppy was terrified, but it had not run from him. It had run to him. Something in that simple instinct cut through the rising surge in his chest. Not all at once, not cleanly, but enough. Rowan bent, slower this time, and lifted the puppy in both hands. Its heartbeat hammered wildly against his palms. He stood there holding it while the wind pressed and released against the cabin walls. One breath, then another. The puppy buried its muzzle against the sleeve of his shirt, still trembling, and Rowan felt himself come back fully into the room. When he finally sat down again, he did not place the puppy back on the blanket right away. He kept it resting against his leg, one hand loosely curved around its back until the shivering eased. The fire cracked softly. The cabin settled. Outside, the wind continued, but it had lost its power to transform the room. Rowan stared into the flames, not thinking exactly, but aware of an uncomfortable truth taking shape. He had leaned on that small life for steadiness more than he wanted to admit. "You're not staying," he said quietly, though the sentence no longer sounded convincing. The puppy twitched one ear and fell asleep against him. The rest of the night came in broken pieces. Rowan moved to the narrow bed in the back room and laid a folded blanket on the floor beside it. The puppy followed him there without hesitation and circled twice before lying down. Each time Rowan half woke to the sound of wind or shifting wood, he listened instinctively for the tiny pattern of breathing beside the bed. By dawn, he had slept more than he had in weeks, and that fact unsettled him almost as much as the night itself. Morning light came cleaner than the day before. The The sky remained pale, but the fog had lifted enough to reveal the black line of pines and the rough silver of the ocean beyond them. Rowan mixed another bottle of formula, and this time the puppy drank with urgent focus. Afterward, it tried to follow him all the way to the sink, legs still unsteady but stubbornly committed. Rowan stared down at it and made his decision. Better to end this now, before routine made the attachment harder to break. Rachel had mentioned a woman in town who sometimes fostered dogs between placements, an older widow with a heated mudroom and more patience than most people deserved. Rowan drove there just after 10. The house sat on a side street above the harbor, white clapboards, blue shutters, neat porch, a place that smelled from the outside like soap and old cedar. He parked, cut the engine, and reached for the puppy. The reaction was immediate. The puppy stiffened in his hands before Rowan had fully opened the door. Its breathing turned shallow and rapid. When he tried to set it down on the passenger seat to adjust the blanket, it retched up a little milk, then twisted desperately back toward the cab, scrambling with weak, frantic movements toward the interior of the truck. Rowan froze. The puppy made a low, panicked sound he had not heard before and pressed itself into the crease of the seat, as though trying to disappear there. When Rowan lifted it again, it struggled only long enough to turn back toward the open truck door. He closed the door and stood still, the puppy held against his chest, feeling the terror shudder through its body. This was not stubbornness. It was fear so immediate it overrode everything else. Rowan looked at the neat house, the blue shutters, the exact sort of place a reasonable man would call safer than his own. Then he looked back at the truck. The cabin might be lonely, drafty, and badly repaired in places, but it was the only place the puppy knew that no longer included loss in its center. He got back in and drove home. The decision settled over him gradually on the road back, not as surrender, but as a temporary truce. At the cabin, he set the puppy down near the fireplace again. It looked around once, saw where it was, and visibly relaxed. Rowan leaned against the counter, arms folded, watching the small body curl into the blanket with a trust that irritated him precisely because it had already begun to matter. He needed a name, if only for practical reasons. Something neutral, something that did not promise love or permanence. His gaze drifted toward the window, where the Atlantic showed in brief silver flashes between the trees. A harbor was not a home. It was only a place to wait out weather, a place to survive until movement was possible again. Harbor, Rowan said. The puppy lifted its head. It was a safe name, Rowan told himself. Temporary, functional, nothing more. But when he crossed the room a minute later, Harbor got to his feet and followed him, small paws tapping softly over the old floorboards, as if the name had already become a promise. Harbor followed Rowan everywhere, though followed was still too confident a word for the way the small dog moved. It was more a determined drifting, a series of short, uneven steps taken in Rowan's direction whenever he crossed the cabin. The puppy's legs were still slightly unsteady, its paws too large for its body, causing it to stumble occasionally on the uneven floorboards. Rowan slowed without thinking, adjusting his pace so the distance between them never widened too far. He told himself it was practical. If Harbor fell behind, it might cry. If it cried, the quiet would break in ways he did not want to manage. Morning routines formed quietly. Rowan heated water, mixed formula, and set the bowl near the fireplace. Harbor drank with concentration, occasionally lifting its head to check Rowan's position before continuing. Afterward, it padded after him through the cabin, pausing whenever he stopped, resuming whenever he moved. Rowan kept his distance, never calling the dog, never encouraging it, but he stopped closing doors behind him. The space between rooms remained open. The coastline beyond the cabin had settled after the storm. The air smelled of salt and damp kelp drying along the rocks. Rowan walked down toward the old dock below the bluff to check the rope lines he had ignored for months. Harbor followed, slipping once on wet grass, then continuing stubbornly. At the dock, Rowan crouched to examine a loose plank. Harbor sat beside him, ears lifting at the sound of gulls overhead. When Rowan shifted, Harbor leaned closer, then relaxed when he remained still. The movement was subtle, but Rowan noticed. The nights improved gradually. Rowan slept longer, waking only when the wind struck hard against the siding. Harbor slept near the bed, sometimes shifting closer during stronger gusts. The quiet breathing beside the floor replaced the hollow silence Rowan had grown used to. He did not acknowledge the change, but he noticed he no longer lay awake waiting for sounds that never came. Repairs began without planning. A loose board on the porch drew Rowan outside with a hammer and nails. Harbor sat near the steps, watching every movement. Rowan replaced the warped plank, then tightened the railing that had begun to wobble. He moved to the shed next, fixing a hinge that had rusted through. The work extended naturally, one small repair leading to another. Harbor followed from task to task, occasionally stepping into the path of falling sawdust, then retreating with mild confusion. 2 days later, Rowan drove into town for supplies. Harbor rode in the passenger seat, calmer now, head resting on the folded blanket. The harbor appeared quiet, boats moving slowly in the gray water. Rowan stopped near more veterinary care. In daylight, he noticed the sag in the rear roofline more clearly. The boards dipped inward above the kennels, darkened by water damage. Rachel stepped outside as he approached. She looked tired, though her posture remained steady. Harbor trotted forward, tail giving a small, uncertain movement. "She's doing well," Rachel said softly. Rowan nodded. "Eating better." Rachel glanced back at the roof. "I may have to close for a bit. The kennel roof's getting worse. I don't have funds to fix it right now." Rowan followed her gaze. The warped boards reminded him of the quiet room where Molly had died. The memory came without warning, not sharp, but heavy. He shifted his weight. "I can look at it," Rowan said. "Just returning the favor." Rachel studied him briefly, then nodded. "I won't argue." The next morning, Rowan returned with tools. The kennel structure was smaller than it looked, but the damage ran deeper than expected. Rowan climbed warily, testing each board. Harbor paced below, glancing up whenever Rowan moved. The puppy's attention stayed fixed, as though monitoring his position. Rowan removed softened planks, replaced them with spare lumber, and reinforced the support beam with salvaged wood. Rachel moved in and out, holding the ladder, handing nails, and checking animals inside. Their conversation remained practical. Harbor wandered between them, occasionally sniffing the kennel doors, then returning to Rowan. By midday, a fisherman named Elias stopped near the gate. He was broad-shouldered, in his late 50s, with weathered skin and a gray beard trimmed unevenly. He carried a small crate of scrapwood. "Figured you could use this," he said. Rachel thanked him. Elias nodded toward Harbor. "That the pup from the road?" Rowan glanced down. "Yeah." Elias watched the dog a moment. "Good to see one back." He set the crate down and left. Later, an older woman named Linda arrived with a bundle of roofing nails. She was short, with silver hair and a calm, practical expression. Harbor approached cautiously, then relaxed when she crouched and spoke softly. Linda smiled faintly. "Little one's making the place feel alive again." Rowan continued working without replying, but he heard the words. By late afternoon, the roof stood straighter. Rowan climbed down, wiping tar from his hands. Harbor circled him once, then settled near his boot. Rachel leaned against the doorway, studying the repair. "That should hold," Rowan said. Rachel nodded. "You didn't have to do that," Rowan shrugged. "Just returning the favor." They stood quietly. Harbor wandered between them, then paused near the edge of the lot, watching gulls overhead. Rowan realized he had spent hours working beside someone else without discomfort. The town no longer felt entirely distant. On the drive back, Harbor fell asleep against the seat. Rowan watched the road, aware of the unfamiliar calm in his chest. The ocean darkened under evening light. Back at the cabin, Rowan added wood to the fire. Harbor stretched, then settled beside him. The small movements of the day lingered in his mind: repairs, quiet conversations, people arriving without expectation. None of it had been planned. None of it had been dramatic. But something had shifted. The cabin no longer felt like a place he waited to leave. It felt, quietly and without permission, like somewhere he might remain a little longer. The first time Rowan was sure something was wrong, the truck was still too far away to see. He had just stepped out onto the porch with a mug of black coffee, cooling in his hand, when Harbor, half-grown but still all uneven paws and uncertain angles, froze beside the door. The puppy had been sniffing at a coil of rope left near the railing. Then, without warning, its body tightened. One ear flattened. Its head lifted toward the inland road above the bluff, though nothing was visible through the line of dark spruce. Rowan stood still and listened. At first he heard only the sea, low and constant below the rocks. Then it came, faint, almost beneath hearing, a heavy engine note carried across the damp morning air. Harbor backed 2 steps toward the cabin before the truck even appeared. When the vehicle finally came into view through a gap in the trees, it was only a large box truck moving along the county road, nothing remarkable in daylight. But Harbor had already dropped low to the porch boards, trembling in a way Rowan had not seen since the first days after the storm. Not random fear, not the broad nervousness of a young animal startled by sound. This was narrower than that, sharper, as if the body had recognized the danger before the mind had time to understand it. Rowan crouched slowly beside the puppy without touching it at first. Harbor's eyes remained fixed toward the road until the engine faded into distance. Only then did the rigid line of its back loosen slightly. "You know that sound," Rowan said quietly. Harbor did not look at him. Its breathing stayed fast for several seconds more, then began to ease. Rowan rested one hand briefly near the puppy's shoulder, not holding, only grounding. The reaction stayed with him long after the road had gone silent again. He had seen animals panic before, during storms, around gunfire, after injury. This felt different, conditioned, not startled, learned somewhere the dog could not explain. By noon, he had found himself listening for engines. The day had cleared into a pale, wind-burnished brightness. Rowan spent part of the morning repairing an old line hauler bracket near the bluff path, but his attention kept shifting upward toward the road. Harbor followed as usual, never far from his boots, but twice more. The puppy paused and looked toward sounds Rowan had not yet fully picked up. The second time, it happened nearly half a minute before a long commercial truck came humming past the far bend. Again, Harbor crouched low and stayed there until the sound had disappeared completely. That was enough to send Rowan into town. The dockside fuel shed stood near the working end of the harbor, where lobster crates, bait barrels, and coils of wet rope gave the whole place the sour, salty smell of labor. Walter Briggs sat outside on an overturned crate repairing a net. He looked as though he had been built by weather rather than born into it, thin but durable, with ropey wrists, stooped shoulders, and skin so lined and browned by years at sea that it seemed carved instead of aged. A loose white beard ran along his jaw, and his pale blue eyes had the patient look of a man who noticed more than he repeated. Walter glanced at Harbor first. "That the little one from the storm road?" Rowan nodded. "Yeah." Walter resumed working the net through his fingers. "Poor thing's got the look." "What look?" Walter tied a knot before answering. "The kind that comes after confinement. Seen it before. Dogs that don't flinch at gulls or waves, but shake apart at diesel." Rowan felt something settle heavier inside him. "You've seen more?" Walter nodded. 3, maybe 4 over the last couple months. Not town strays, good dogs, fed dogs. Wrong roads, wrong condition. He looked up then, gaze narrowing toward Harbor. One was found out by Cutler Turnoff, another near the old quarry road. Folks said dumped. I'm not sure dumped covers it. Harbor leaned quietly against Rowan's shin. "Who'd do that?" Rowan asked. Walter gave a dry half shrug. "Whoever makes money first and conscience later." He pulled another length of net into his lap. "Ben Foster's been asking around." That sent Rowan the rest of the way to the sheriff's office. The building was small, white-painted, functional, with a flag snapping weakly in the breeze, and a row of muddy prints on the front steps. Inside, the office smelled faintly of coffee, paper, and damp canvas. Deputy Ben Foster stood behind the front counter sorting through a stack of incident reports. He was in his early 40s, tall and broad through the shoulders, with short light brown hair cut close at the sides and a beard trimmed neatly enough to suggest habit rather than vanity. A pale scar crossed one eyebrow, barely visible unless he turned his head. His expression was calm in the way of people who had learned not to waste motion or language. He looked up when Rowan entered, then glanced toward Harbor. "You're the man from up the bluff road." Rowan nodded once, Walter Briggs said you were asking about dogs. Ben set the papers down. I've been asking about a lot of things, dogs included. He came around the counter and crouched far enough away not to crowd Harbor. This the pup from the storm? Yeah. Ben held out a hand loosely. Harbor sniffed it, hesitated, then remained close to Rowan's leg. She reacts to trucks, Rowan said, before they're close, sometimes before I hear them. Ben's face sharpened slightly. How strong a reaction. Not noise, specific. She goes low, shakes, watches the road. Ben rose again, expression turning more thoughtful than skeptical. That tracks with what I've heard. He motioned Rowan toward a smaller side desk where a county map was spread beneath a paperweight. We've had reports of dogs showing up along secondary roads, coastal access lanes, old logging pull-offs, places people don't use unless they mean to. No collars, no chips, good breeds or good mixes. Too well fed to be wild, too frightened to have simply wandered. He tapped 3 places on the map with a pen. One point lay north of town, another farther inland. The third was uncomfortably close to Rowan's stretch of road. Any witnesses? Rowan asked. Nothing useful yet. One road crew saw a white utility-style truck parked near a turnout before dawn 2 weeks ago. No company markings. Gone before they circled back. Could be unrelated. Ben paused. Could also not be. Rowan looked down at Harbor, then at the map again. Molly's broken body on the roadside no longer felt isolated. It felt placed within a pattern he had been unwilling to see all at once. You think transport? Rowan asked. Mba asked. Ben exhaled through his nose. I think someone's moving dogs through back roads where fewer people ask questions. Whether it's illegal breeding, resale, abandonment, or something messier, I'm not ready to say. But it's not random. The room stayed quiet a moment. You live where you can hear that road before most people do, Ben said. And from the bluff you've got long sight lines in both directions, right? Rowan nodded. Ben reached for a card and wrote a direct number on the back. If you notice anything odd, late trucks, repeated routes, vehicles stopping where they shouldn't, call me. Don't follow, don't confront, just call. Rowan took the card and slipped it into his jacket pocket. On the way back, he drove more slowly than usual. Every turnout looked different now. Every patch of soft gravel, every break in the tree line, every place where a vehicle could pause unseen for 30 seconds too long. Harbor remained calm until a heavy truck approached from the opposite lane. Then the puppy's whole body drew inward again. Rowan didn't need more confirmation. At the cabin, he set Harbor down and walked the perimeter almost unconsciously, old habits resurfacing with unwelcome precision. He noticed things he might once have ignored, faint tire impressions near the access bend where the ground stayed soft after rain. A broken branch snapped at bumper height, a shallow indentation near the ditch where something heavy might have been dragged or dropped. None of it was proof. All of it was enough to hold in memory. That evening he took an old pair of field binoculars from the drawer beneath the window. The rubber eye cups were cracked, and one hinge had loosened, but the glass still worked. He stood on the porch scanning the road through breaks in the trees while Harbor sat beside him, small and still in the cooling air. The ocean below was nearly flat, reflecting a thin gray band of evening light. Calm again. Too calm. When a low engine drifted across from inland, Harbor tensed before Rowan lifted the binoculars. The truck never came into full view, only moved somewhere beyond the rise and kept going. Still, Rowan stayed where he was until the sound died completely. He looked down at the puppy. Harbor's ears remained pinned for several seconds after the road had gone quiet. Molly wasn't just hit, Rowan said, more to the evening than to the dog. She got away from something. Harbor leaned against his boot. Rowan rested one hand briefly along the puppy's back, then straightened and looked toward the road again. The decision formed without drama. No vow, no speech, just the old cold alignment of attention around a problem that had stopped being abstract. From then on, he would watch. And if the wrong truck came along that stretch of coast again, Rowan Hale intended to see it before it disappeared. The fog stayed low over the harbor that morning, thin enough to see through but thick enough to quiet the town. Rowan parked beside more veterinary care and stepped out without slamming the truck door. Harbor jumped down after him, still slightly oversized in the paws, still moving with a puppy's uneven determination, but stronger now. The dog paused briefly, glancing toward the road before settling at Rowan's side. The habit remained, so did Rowan's awareness of it. Rachel stood near the side enclosure, examining the ground where several kennel posts leaned unevenly. Her posture was tired but steady. Sleeves rolled up, auburn hair tied loosely behind her neck. She glanced up as Rowan approached, then nodded in quiet acknowledgement. "Fence line's getting worse," she said. Rowan followed her gaze. The posts tilted toward the salt-worn soil, wire sagging between them. "I can reset them." Rachel studied him briefly. "You don't have to." Rowan shrugged. "Already here?" Harbor settled at his feet while Rowan tested the first post. The wood shifted under pressure. He fetched tools from the truck and began digging around the base. The motion was deliberate, methodical. Harbor watched closely, repositioning whenever Rowan moved. When Rowan knelt, the puppy lowered itself beside him. When Rowan stood, Harbor stood. Rachel noticed but didn't comment. By mid-morning, Rowan had replaced 2 posts. The work drew little attention, but the quiet rhythm of hammering carried across the lot. Harbor lay beneath the fence rail, chin on its paws, eyes tracking Rowan's movements. Once, a distant engine sounded from the inland road. Harbor lifted its head immediately. Rowan paused, listening. The sound faded. Both relaxed. Daniel Pierce arrived shortly after. He stepped from his truck carrying a bundle of treated lumber. He was tall, broad-shouldered, early 30s, with sun-browned skin and a short blonde beard. His movements were economical, eyes scanning the work area before he spoke. "Thought you could use these," he said. Rowan nodded. "Thanks." Daniel set the boards down and began measuring the fence line without further conversation. The 2 men worked side by side, communicating mostly through gesture. Harbor moved between them briefly, then returned to Rowan's boots. An older woman arrived later carrying folded blankets. Helen Morris moved slowly but with purpose. She had soft gray hair braided over one shoulder and a gentle voice that seemed to calm the dogs before she reached them. She replaced bedding in the kennels while Rowan and Daniel reinforced the posts. "You've got a helper," Helen said softly, glancing at Harbor. Rowan did not answer. Harbor leaned lightly against his leg. The work expanded naturally. Rowan repaired the gate hinge. Daniel tightened wire along the fence. Rachel organized feed bins inside the shed. The quiet cooperation felt unforced. No one spoke more than necessary. A rescue dog arrived mid-afternoon, brought by a man who left quickly after explaining he had found it near a warehouse road. The dog was older, a shepherd mix with graying muzzle and wary amber eyes. It stood stiffly near the kennel entrance, uncertain. Rachel glanced at Rowan. "Can you help?" Rowan approached slowly, body angled, voice low. The dog watched him, then took a hesitant step forward. Harbor stayed behind Rowan, observing silently. Rowan guided the dog into the kennel without touching it, letting it choose each step. When the gate closed, the animal settled, still wary but calm. "You've done that before," Rachel said. Rowan wiped his hands on his jacket. "A while ago." He did not elaborate. The memory surfaced briefly, Atlas pacing beside him, alert and focused, but Rowan pushed it aside. Later, Rowan moved toward the shed. Harbor followed, but stopped briefly when a truck passed on the distant road. The puppy stiffened, ears flattening. Rowan glanced up, noting direction and timing. The truck did not slow. Harbor relaxed. Rowan resumed work. Rachel watched him. "You're listening for them now." Rowan didn't deny it, just noticing. By late afternoon, the fence line stood straight. Daniel loaded his tools and offered a brief handshake before leaving. Helen waved quietly and drove off. Rachel closed the last kennel and leaned against the railing. "You didn't say much today," she said. Rowan shrugged. "Didn't need to." Harbor circled once and settled beside him. Rowan rested his hand briefly on the dog's back before withdrawing it. The gesture had become instinctive. On the drive back to the cabin, Harbor slept curled against the seat. Rowan drove slower than usual, watching the roadside. A white delivery truck passed in the opposite direction. Harbor stirred, but did not panic. Rowan noted the difference. At the cabin, Rowan gathered firewood. Harbor wandered behind the shed, disappearing briefly. Rowan straightened immediately, scanning the yard. When the puppy reappeared, he relaxed. The reaction came automatically. Rowan noticed it. That night, the wind tapped lightly against the siding. Rowan lay awake for a moment, listening. Harbor shifted closer to the bed. The steady breathing filled the room. Rowan's shoulders loosened. He realized he had stopped thinking about Harbor as temporary. He had not decided anything. He had not said the words. But when he imagined the cabin empty again, the silence felt heavier than before. Harbor exhaled softly in sleep. Rowan closed his eyes. The change had already happened. The tide had receded farther than usual, leaving wide bands of slick rock exposed beneath the gray Atlantic sky. Rowan walked along the lower coastal path, with Harbor moving a few steps ahead, nose low, tail still. The puppy had grown stronger in recent weeks, but she was still unmistakably young. Her paws slightly too large, her shoulders narrow, her movements careful rather than confident. She normally wandered between scents of salt and seaweed, but this morning her behavior changed. She moved in short, deliberate bursts, pausing often, returning to the same line of rock, as if trying to confirm something she did not fully understand. Rowan noticed immediately. Harbor was not exploring, she was searching. He slowed his pace and let her move without interference. The air smelled of kelp and wet stone, but Harbor ignored both. She moved inland slightly, nose skimming across damp sand where the tide had recently pulled back. Then she stopped, abruptly. Her ears lowered. A faint growl vibrated in her chest, uncertain but persistent. Rowan crouched beside her. He couldn't detect anything unusual, but Harbor's body told him enough. The scent meant something to her. She shifted forward, then glanced back, making sure he followed. Rowan stepped carefully behind her. The trail she chose was barely visible, a narrow break in the scrub brush leading up toward a rocky ridge. The path looked unused, grass bent by wind rather than footsteps. Harbor moved slowly, stopping every few yards, doubling back once, then continuing. This was not trained tracking. It was instinct, confused but determined. At the top of the ridge, Harbor froze. Rowan followed her line of sight and saw the structure partially hidden behind weathered brush. It was a low wooden storage shed, gray and leaning, its boards warped by years of salt air. The roof dipped slightly in the middle. One door hung crooked, half open. From below, the building would have been invisible. Harbor approached cautiously, sniffing along the base of the wall. Then she barked once, sharp and sudden. Rowan stepped forward, tension rising instinctively in his shoulders. He moved slowly, listening before touching the door. The hinge creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale and heavy. Not just damp wood, something else layered beneath it. Ammonia, old animal scent. Rowan paused, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through broken boards. The space was small but organized. Metal transport crates lined one wall, stacked unevenly. Some were large enough for adult dogs, others smaller. A coil of nylon rope lay near the entrance, frayed at one end. A plastic water container rested beside an overturned bowl. Harbor stepped inside and immediately lowered her head. She moved toward one crate, sniffed intensely, then let out a sharper bark. Rowan followed. The inside edges of the crate were scratched. The metal latch had been bent and reclosed. He crouched, examining the floor. Dark stains marked the wood, faded but visible, not fresh, not old enough to disappear entirely. The smell grew stronger near the back corner. Harbor pawed lightly at the boards and whined. Rowan scanned the ground. A thin line of dried residue ran toward the wall. He exhaled slowly. The place had held animals recently. He moved carefully around the room. A folded tarp lay near the back, smelling faintly of diesel. Tire impressions were visible outside the doorway, partially preserved where the overhang blocked rain. The tracks were wide and deep, consistent with a heavy vehicle reversing in. Harbor barked again, then retreated slightly toward Rowan's leg. Her body remained tense. Rowan stepped back outside and studied the ridge. The location was deliberate, hidden from the road, shielded from wind, accessible by a narrow path. Someone had chosen it. He pulled out his phone and dialed Ben. "Foster," Ben answered. "I found something," Rowan said quietly. Structure above the lower rock trail, crates, Looks like staging. Ben paused. Stay where you are. Rowan nodded, though Ben couldn't see him. I'll wait outside. He ended the call and moved downhill a few yards, keeping the shed in view. Harbor sat beside him, still watching the doorway. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the scent again. Rowan felt the quiet tighten. Ben arrived 20 minutes later, descending carefully from the road. He wore a dark jacket and moved with controlled steps, scanning the area before approaching. Harbor remained still but alert. You find this today? Ben asked. Rowan nodded. Ben entered the shed slowly, examining the crates, rope, and floor. He crouched near the stains, then stepped back outside. This isn't abandoned, Ben said. Not completely. Rowan crossed his arms. Molly could have come from here. Ben nodded once. That's what I'm thinking. Harbor barked softly, ears forward. Ben looked down at her. She led you here? Rowan glanced at the puppy. She recognized the scent. Ben took several photos, then radioed quietly for backup. The wind carried the sound of surf against the rocks below. Rowan watched the structure in silence. The suspicion he had carried since the roadside no longer felt abstract. Harbor leaned lightly against his leg. Rowan rested his hand on her back, then withdrew it. You didn't just follow me, he murmured. The tide began to return, water sliding slowly across the stone. The hidden shed remained still behind them. But the quiet no longer meant safety. It meant something waiting to be uncovered. The investigation had begun, and Harbor had found the first real trace. The second nor'easter rolled in after sunset, pushing a wall of cold rain across the main coastline. Wind flattened the tall grass along the bluff and drove salt spray far inland. Rowan stood near the edge of the cabin porch, watching the sky darken, sensing the same heavy pressure that had filled the air the night he first found Harbor's mother. The storm didn't feel sudden. It felt inevitable, as if the coast itself remembered something unfinished. Harbor stopped pacing and lifted her head toward the inland road. Her body stiffened, ears angled forward, eyes narrowing into the wind. She was no longer the uncertain puppy Rowan had carried home weeks earlier. Her frame had lengthened, her shoulders beginning to broaden, her movements quieter and more deliberate. But when the distant engine reached them, she reacted instantly, tension running through her entire body. Rowan heard it seconds later, a low diesel rumble, partially swallowed by wind. Harbor stepped toward the trail without hesitation, then looked back once. Rowan didn't speak. He grabbed his jacket and followed. The rain intensified quickly, soaking the path and turning the rocks slick beneath their boots and paws. They reached the ridge overlooking the hidden shed. Rowan crouched behind the familiar line of stone, while Harbor pressed low beside him. Through sheets of rain, headlights flickered briefly, then vanished. A box truck rolled slowly into position near the structure, its shape barely visible against the darkening coastline. Rowan pulled out his phone and called Ben. It's here, he said quietly. Same place. Ben's voice remained controlled. Units are moving. Stay hidden. Rowan ended the call and lifted the binoculars. Two figures stepped down from the truck, their silhouettes distorted by rain. They opened the rear doors and lowered a metal ramp. The first crate slid down with a dull metallic scrape. Even through the storm, the sound carried. Harbor trembled. Another crate followed, then another. The men moved with practiced efficiency, dragging them into the shed. Rowan counted silently, jaw tightening. Harbor pressed closer to his leg, eyes locked on the movement. Minutes stretched, rain thickened, wind roared across the ridge, then distant lights appeared along the upper road. 3 vehicles approached without sirens, slowing before the ridge. Officers stepped out, moving carefully down the slope. Their dark shapes blended with the storm. Ben reached Rowan's position first, crouching beside him. Rain streamed down his face and beard. He looked through the binoculars briefly, then nodded. That's enough, he murmured. He raised his radio. Go. Flashlights cut through the rain as officers moved in. Voices shouted commands. One suspect froze, then tried to run toward the cab. An officer intercepted him before he reached it. The second stepped backward toward the shed, but stopped when another officer blocked the entrance. The truck engine shut off. Metal clattered. Hands were raised. Rowan stayed still, watching. An officer opened the first crate. A weak bark broke through the storm. Another crate opened, then another. The sounds multiplied. Thin whines, hoarse barking, the frantic scratching of frightened animals. Harbor leaned forward, ears fully raised. Dogs began emerging one by one. Some stumbled, legs stiff from confinement. Others refused to leave until coaxed gently. Officers worked quickly, carrying them through the rain toward transport vans waiting above. Rowan counted again without meaning to. 8, 12, 17. The number kept rising. A shepherd mix collapsed briefly before being lifted carefully. Two smaller dogs pressed tightly together inside another crate. One officer wrapped them in a blanket before carrying them uphill. Harbor watched every movement, body rigid. 20, someone called. Another crate came out from the shed. The door opened. A young shepherd stepped forward hesitantly, ribs visible beneath damp fur. Rowan felt something tighten in his chest. The dog blinked against the rain before being guided gently away. 23, Ben said quietly. The suspects were escorted toward patrol vehicles, wrists secured. Rain washed across the ground, blurring tire tracks and footprints. Officers continued loading the rescued dogs into transport vans. Doors slammed shut one by one. Harbor stepped forward slightly, then stopped. Rowan rested his hand on her back. She leaned into him, still watching the scene. The shed stood open now, empty. The truck doors swung in the wind. The hidden operation no longer felt concealed. It looked small and fragile under flashing lights and rain. Ben exhaled slowly. That's the whole group. Rowan nodded but didn't speak. He watched as the last dog was carried uphill. The sound of engines started again, softer this time. One by one, the vehicles pulled away. The ridge fell quiet except for wind and surf. Rowan remained standing, rain soaking through his jacket. Harbor sat beside him, breathing steady now. The storm continued, but something inside Rowan felt different. The tension that had followed the investigation for weeks finally loosened. More than 20 dogs had been taken out of cages that night, and the first step toward that moment had begun with a wounded mother lying in the rain. Harbor leaned lightly against Rowan's leg. He didn't move away. For the first time since the storm began, Rowan felt the silence settle without weight. The coast roared around them, but the ridge felt calm. Behind them, the hidden shed stood empty. Ahead, the road lights disappeared into rain. Rowan rested his hand on Harbor's back, and together they watched the storm carry the night forward. By early spring, the Maine coastline had changed its voice. The Atlantic was still cold, still iron gray in the mornings, but the sharp cruelty of winter had loosened. Meltwater slipped through the rocks below the bluff, and the wind no longer cut like broken glass when Rowan stepped outside at dawn. Patches of green had begun to return along the edges of the path behind the cabin. The world did not look reborn exactly. It looked as if it had survived. Harbor was waiting on the porch when Rowan opened the door. She had grown into herself over the months, though traces of puppyhood still remained in the quickness of her movements and the occasional way she tilted her head before deciding what a sound meant. Her body had lengthened into a lean young German shepherd frame, still not fully filled out, but strong now, balanced, sure-footed. The dark saddle along her back had settled into a rich black-brown, and the tan along her legs and chest glowed warmer in spring light. Her ears stood clean and alert. When Rowan moved, she rose with him, not out of fear anymore, but because companionship had become her instinct. The cabin behind them had changed too. The warped porch board was gone. The roof no longer leaked. A second lamp burned warmly beside the door in the evenings, and the path down toward the bluff had been cleared of fallen branches and winter debris. Rowan had repaired things almost without noticing he was doing it. At first, he had told himself it was practical. Then the repairs became habit. Then they became something else. Care, perhaps. The kind that did not ask permission before taking root. He and Harbor drove into town just after sunrise. The road that had once felt like a corridor of avoidance now looked different in spring. Fishing boats moved in and out of the harbor under a pale wash of morning light. And the town seemed less like a place Rowan passed through than one he had quietly begun to belong to. The old clinic had changed with the season as well. The hand-painted sign above the entrance now read, coastal animal rescue, and veterinary care, the new lettering added beneath the old in a slightly darker shade of blue. Fresh lumber framed the side kennels. A bulletin board near the front porch carried volunteer schedules, donation notes, and handwritten thank you cards from families who had adopted rescued dogs after the winter bust. Inside, the building hummed with the ordinary sounds of useful work. Mops against tile, metal bowls being set down, quiet voices, dogs shifting in kennels with less fear than before. Rachel stood near the treatment table sorting medication into plastic bins. She looked tired in the honest, functional way she always had. But the strain that once sharpened her face had eased. Her dark hair was pulled back loosely, and there was more steadiness than exhaustion in her posture now. She glanced up when Rowan entered and smiled without surprise, as if his presence had long since become part of the rhythm of the place. "You're early," she said. Rowan shrugged lightly. "So are you." Rachel set one of the bins aside. "Don't say that like it's a criticism." Harbor moved calmly through the room, pausing near each kennel with quiet curiosity. She no longer startled at every metallic sound. When one nervous hound backed deeper into the corner, Harbor simply lowered her head and passed by without crowding it. Another younger dog, recently brought in after the winter rescue, rose uncertainly and wagged once. Harbor stood still, neither inviting nor rejecting, and the other dog settled again. "She's good for them," Rachel said softly, watching. Rowan looked down at Harbor. "She's calm." Rachel gave him a look that suggested she understood the understatement. She learned from someone. He didn't answer. He rarely did when truth got too close to praise. The rescue center had grown not through miracles, but through accumulation. After the seizure of the transport truck and the publicity that followed, people across the county had sent what they could: bags of food, fencing wire, lumber, crates, blankets, checks with small amounts written in careful handwriting. The town itself had done the rest. Fishermen repaired drainage, a retired teacher handled adoption calls. Helen still brought blankets every Thursday. Daniel had helped build a covered run along the rear lot. None of it had been dramatic. That was why it mattered. The place had survived because enough people decided not to look away. Rowan spent the morning helping with the dogs, least willing to trust human hands. He moved through the routine slowly, without forcing contact, standing near a kennel until the dog stopped trembling, placing a bowl down and stepping back, letting fear exhaust itself into curiosity. Harbor stayed with him, never interfering but always present. More than once, Rowan noticed anxious dogs watching Harbor first, before deciding whether to watch him. By noon, the center had settled into its daily rhythm. Rachel handed Rowan a clipboard with feeding notes, and he almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Months ago, he had barely tolerated being responsible for himself. Now he was checking meal schedules for 6 rescue dogs and reminding a volunteer not to overfeed the youngest shepherd mix. Later that afternoon, when the work eased, Rowan took Harbor out along the bluff behind the rescue center. The grass there had begun to green, and small white wildflowers pushed up near the rocks where the soil stayed shallow. The sea lay open beneath them, restless but no longer cruel. Harbor walked ahead, then slowed as they approached a simple wooden marker near the edge of the slope. Molly. The marker was plain, its surface sanded smooth by weather and touched up by hand, where the salt had begun to wear the letters. Someone, probably Rachel, had set stones around the base to keep the spring runoff from washing the soil away. Rowan crouched and placed a small bundle of wildflowers there, stems still damp from where he had picked them along the trail. Harbor came to sit beside him. She did not whine, she did not paw at the ground. She only sat there, steady and quiet, while the wind moved lightly through her coat. Rowan looked at the marker for a long time before speaking. "I kept the promise." The words were simple, but they opened more than he expected. He had kept the obvious promise, yes. Harbor had lived. She had grown strong. But standing there, Rowan understood that Molly had entrusted him with more than a puppy. She had handed him the one thing he had spent years refusing, a reason to remain in the world without standing apart from it. He rested one hand lightly along Harbor's back. "She did more than survive," he said quietly, almost to the grave itself. "She brought me back." The wind carried the words out toward the water. When they returned to town, the light had begun to soften into evening. Rowan stayed until the last kennel check was finished, then drove home with Harbor in the passenger seat, head lifted toward the open crack of window where salt air moved through. The road to the cabin no longer felt like a retreat route. It felt like the road home. By the time he turned into the drive, the porch lamps were already glowing. He had left them on deliberately that morning, a small act that still would have felt impossible a season ago. Back then, light had seemed like invitation, and invitation had felt dangerous. Now, it felt different. Necessary, perhaps, like acknowledgement. He opened the cabin door and stepped inside. Warmth met him first, the steady heat of a fire banked low, the faint scent of cedar, the sound of Harbor's nails on the floorboards as she crossed toward the hearth. Rowan set his keys on the table and stood in the center of the room, listening. Not for threats, not for memories, for presence. Harbor circled twice and settled near the fire, then lifted her head to look at him. Rowan moved to the kitchen, filled her water bowl, and set it down. She drank, then returned to the hearth and lay there with the calm certainty of something that knew it belonged. Rowan leaned one shoulder against the doorway and let the silence gather around them. It no longer felt empty. Atlas still lived somewhere inside him, in the old hurt and the old loyalty that would never completely leave. Molly lived here too, in quieter ways, in the dog by the fire, in the repair marks on the porch, in the fact that the lamp by the door had been left on for someone waiting to return. None of that erased grief. It changed its shape. Harbor looked up again. Rowan crossed the room and rested his hand along her back. "You're home," he said. And this time the words were not caution, not temporary, not a name he could explain away. They were fact. Outside, the Atlantic moved under the soft dark of spring evening. Inside, the cabin held warmth, breath, and the unforced peace of a life no longer lived alone. And for the first time in many years, Rowan Hale did not feel like a man passing through his own days. He felt rooted there, in that light, in that quiet, in that small shared home by the sea. Sometimes healing does not arrive as a grand miracle, but as a quiet life placed in our path when we least expect it. Rowan thought he rescued a wounded dog, yet what truly happened was that compassion led him back to people, purpose, and hope. Harbor became more than a companion. She became a reminder that God often works through small living moments. A second chance, a shared burden, a community choosing kindness. In everyday life, we all meet chances to stop, help, and change someone's story. If this touched you, share it, leave a comment, subscribe, and may God bless you and your family with peace, strength, and unexpected grace.